Today, we're tackling something really significant. It's a deep exploration of anti-colonial and decolonial thought. Specifically, we're looking at how research itself and knowledge systems are being decolonized.
Yeah, and we're grounding this whole discussion in some really pivotal work, particularly Linda Tuhiwai Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. It's foundational.
Absolutely essential reading for this topic, and it forces you right from the get-go to see things very, very differently.
It really does. I mean, the opening salvo, the main critique she starts with, it's kind of stunningly direct. It makes anyone involved in, global studies, research, history, it makes you stop and think.
It does. She puts it right out there. From the perspective of colonized peoples, the very word research. Well, she says it's arguably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary.
Dirty. That's such a strong word. I mean, for many of us, especially in academia, we think of research as this, neutral search for knowledge, for truth. So why dirty? Why that visceral reaction?
Well, it's deliberately provocative, right? It forces you immediately to shed that idea of neutrality. Because when research comes up in many indigenous communities, it doesn't spark intellectual curiosity. No. It often brings silence or deep suspicion. It brings back really, really bad memories because historically, research wasn't separate from colonialism. It was tangled right up in it.
Part of the machinery.
Exactly, a tool of European imperialism. And that connection, that history, it offended the deepest sense of, humanity and sovereignty.
Okay, so let's dig into that trauma then. Because like you said, it's not just abstract theory. It's about remembered violence, actual practices.
Precisely. Research was used as a way to subjugate people, often through dehumanizing practices. Smith gives this horrifying example to really ground it.
What was that?
She talks about the historical practice of so-called scientific research that involved measuring the faculties of indigenous peoples. And one method involved, taking the skulls of ancestors.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Filling them with millet seeds, and then comparing the amount of seed they held to somehow gauge mental capacity, trying to create these pseudoscientific racial hierarchies.
Camilla seeds, that specific detail is it's chilling. It makes it so concrete. This wasn't detached observation. It was, like you said, part of the colonial project, using science to justify racism and control.
Absolutely. And that specific act, that level of disrespect for ancestors, for the dead, used to rank the living. You can see how that legacy feeds directly into contemporary mistrust.
Of course. It wasn't neutral then. The memory of that isn't neutral now. Research was fundamentally an act of objectification, treating people, their ancestors, their culture, as just specimens, raw data.
Yeah, specimens to be collected, classified, and controlled. It was a tool of empire, no question.
So that sets up our task for today then. It's pretty ambitious. First, really unpack this powerful critique, why research became such a loaded, damaging term. And then pivot to the alternative. Because this isn't just about tearing down, it's also about building up. How are indigenous scholars around the world researching back?
Right. How are they actively reclaiming their knowledge, their stories, their ways of knowing, taking back control of their own narratives and futures?
Exactly. It's research is resistance. Research is reclamation. That's the deep dive today.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of the critique. This idea of Western knowledge ownership. It runs deep, and it causes this ongoing structural resentment in many indigenous communities.
And it's kind of a double bind, isn't it? There's this weird contradiction baked into the colonial approach to knowledge.
How do you mean?
Well, on one side, Western systems seem obsessed with consuming indigenous knowledge, taking ideas, images, cultural creations, classifying them, putting them in museums or archives.
Right, extracting and claiming ownership.
But then, at the very same time, those same systems deny the humanity, the agency, the validity of the indigenous peoples who created that knowledge in the first place. They deny their claims to self-determination.
Yes. It's the ultimate kind of intellectual colonization, isn't it? We value your stuff, your knowledge, your art, even your biological material enough to take it.
We'll integrate it into our supposedly superior system.
But, and this is the crucial part, we don't value you, the people, enough to recognize your sovereignty, your right to govern yourselves, or even your capacity for sophisticated thought. It's deeply insulting.
And Smith argues this isn't random. This systematic denial is propped up by a powerful intellectual structure. We need to talk about this concept of the cultural archive.
Yeah, this is really important. It draws on thinkers like Foucault and Stuart Hall. The cultural archive isn't just, a dusty library or a museum basement.
It's more active than that.
Much more active. Think of it as this vast, deep reservoir of Western history. Texts, artifacts, scientific theories, images, ideas, everything that's been collected and validated by the West over centuries.
Okay, so it's the collective memory and knowledge bank of the West, basically.
Sort of, but it's not passive. It's a mechanism. It actively does things in the colonial relationship. Smith points out, drawing on Hull, 4 key functions.
Okay, what are they?
First, it characterizes other societies. It sorts them, classifies them primitive, advanced, civilized, savage.
It's the categories.
Right. Second, it condenses complex realities into simple, manageable, often stereotypical images. Think about the noble savage or the exotic other.
Stereotypes that serve a purpose.
Exactly. Third, it provides the standard model for comparison. Western society becomes the norm, the benchmark against which everyone else is measured.
And inevitably found wanting.
Which leads to the fourth function. It supplies the criteria for evaluation. The West doesn't just judge, it sets the rules for judgment. It defines what counts as progress, as history, as valid knowledge.
Wow. So the archive isn't just storing information. It's actively shaping reality by defining the terms of engagement. It lets the West define its own superiority by creating the very scale used for measurement.
Precisely. It constructs the other in a way that always positions the West at the top. And this directly fuels that core problem we started with, dehumanization through objectification.
Making people into objects of study.
Yes. The whole research enterprise, anthropology, biology, history, linguistics, it often operated by turning indigenous peoples, their bodies, their cultures, their lands, into these sort of inert, problematic things to be studied, dissected, classified.
Rendered less than human, essentially.
Or at least not fully human in the same way Westerners saw themselves. And that perception, that objectification, that's what makes colonial intervention seem legitimate, even necessary.
And the really disturbing part is that this isn't just ancient history. This way of thinking, this dehumanizing gaze, it persists. It just puts on new clothes, maybe uses the language of genetics or intellectual property now.
Absolutely. Think about the more recent controversies. The attempts to patent human genetic material from indigenous groups. Smith brings up the example of the U.S. National Institutes of Health trying to patent genetic material from a member of the Hagahai people in Papua New Guinea in the 90s.
Patenting a human being's genetic code.
Essentially treating their unique biology not as part of a person or a community with rights, but as a kind of natural resource, like finding a new plant or mineral deposit.
So the logic is the same as the skull measuring, just updated. Extraction and commodification.
Exactly. It's the scientific or corporate appropriation of the very essence of humanness, treating indigenous life itself as a source of potentially profitable data for the developed world, rather than recognizing inherent sovereignty and knowledge.
That's the enduring power, the enduring danger of that cultural archive. It keeps reproducing these patterns.
It does. It provides the framework.
Okay, that analysis of the cultural archive really lays the groundwork. If colonial research is built on this foundation of extraction and objectification, then we need to look at the tools it used, the big ideas, the concepts, the assumptions that made it all seem logical at the time.
Right. We need to unpack the conceptual pillars, as you call them. Things like imperialism, the Western idea of history, the role of writing, and even theory itself. And crucially, how indigenous scholars are now challenging and redefining these very concepts.
Let's start with imperialism.
Yeah.
Often, when we first learn about it, the focus is very much on economics, right?
Yeah.
Like Hobson or Lenin talking about needing new markets, resources, rescuing capitalism.
Yeah, that's the classic economic interpretation, and it's definitely part of the picture. Securing resources, controlling trade routes, exploiting labor, absolutely central.
But indigenous perspectives, like Smith's, argue that seeing imperialism only through an economic lens is too narrow. It misses the bigger picture of power.
Exactly. They'd say, yes, the economics are crucial, but imperialism was, and in many ways still is, much more than that. It's a total system.
Total in what sense?
It's a system of control, of establishing a certain kind of order, a set of principles that structure the entire globe, politically, yes, but also culturally, intellectually, spiritually. It's about imposing a worldview, a way of being.
So it's not just about taking stuff, it's about reshaping minds and societies.
Fundamentally, it's a pervasive power dynamic. So decolonization can't just be about economic adjustments. It has to confront this entire system, including the assumptions embedded in how we even think about the world, how we do research.
Which leads us to another huge assumption, the Western concept of history itself. You mentioned the myth of linear history. What's that about?
Well, the dominant Western way of thinking about history is very linear. time marches forward in a straight line, from primitive beginnings towards, well, implicitly towards the peak of modern Western civilization.
Progress.
Progress, exactly. And to make that timeline work, you need a starting point for when other societies officially enter history. And that point is almost always
The moment Europeans discovered them.
right. The moment of contact, the moment they get written into the Western record, that's year zero for their official history.
So what happens to everything that came before that discovery? All the millennia of indigenous history, knowledge, civilization.
It gets relegated, pushed aside. It's labeled prehistory. It belongs to the realm of myth, legend, oral tradition, things considered unreliable, subjective, not proper history, according to Western academic standards.
So it basically erases or devalues indigenous timelines, their own ways of recording history, their complex knowledge systems.
Absolutely. It negates their legitimate claims to a deep, documented past. If your society didn't develop literacy in the Roman alphabet or build states that look like European ones, you're effectively pushed outside of history with a capital H. You become timeless, unchanging, primitive.
And that ties directly into the next pillar, the problem of writing and literacy.
Yes, because historically, within that Western framework, the ability to write, specifically using alphabetic scripts, was seen as the ultimate marker of civilization.
Proof of rationality, objective thought.
Exactly. It was believed that writing allowed for abstract thought, critical distance, objective recording, all the things deemed necessary for advanced societies. Societies without writing, or with different systems like pictographs or oral traditions, were judged as
More emotional, less capable of complex thought.
right. Stuck in the communal, the traditional, the subjective. Their knowledge wasn't seen as real knowledge, just folklore or custom.
There's a powerful quote from the Maori writer Patricia Grace that flips this completely on its head. She argues that for indigenous communities, books are dangerous. That sounds so counterintuitive to everything we're taught about literacy being empowering.
It's a profoundly challenging statement, isn't it? It cuts right through the easy assumption that literacy is always good. Grace identifies, I think, 4 key dangers that books, particularly those from the colonizer, pose to indigenous communities.
Okay.
First, she says, published books often fail to reflect or reinforce indigenous values, customs, identity. They present a different world, which can lead to cultural confusion or erosion, especially for young people.
Undermining their own culture.
Second, by constantly centering the colonizer's story, their history, their achievements, books can implicitly or explicitly state that indigenous people simply don't exist in the modern world, or that their existence is marginal, unimportant.
Erasing them from the narrative.
Third, when books do mention indigenous people, they often get it wrong. They contain inaccuracies, distortions, harmful stereotypes, damaging generalizations based on that flawed cultural archive we talked about.
Perpetuating untruths.
And fourth, related to that, they often convey deeply negative or insensitive messages, leading to internalized racism, that insidious feeling within the community that maybe they are no good, that the colonizer's negative view is somehow true. It attacks self-worth.
That's devastating. And it creates a real dilemma, even for indigenous people who want to resist this through writing, doesn't it? The act of writing back is also fraught with danger.
Hugely fraught. There's a constant tightrope walk. On one hand, you risk accidentally reinforcing the dominant discourse just by using its language or framework.
Getting co-opted.
Or, maybe even more worryingly, by writing about your community, sharing internal knowledge, cultural practices, even strategies for resistance, you make yourself vulnerable. That information can be easily misunderstood, twisted, appropriated.
Used against the community.
Exactly, by the state, by academics with their own agendas, by corporations. So the decision to speak out, to write, versus remaining silent to protect the community, it's an incredibly complex calculation with real consequences.
Okay, one last concept to touch on here. The academic field of post-colonialism. This term pops up a lot, suggesting we're somehow after colonialism now.
And that's precisely why it raises red flags for many indigenous scholars and activists around the world. The post implies it's over, done with, something safely in the past that academics can now theorize about.
But for many indigenous communities, it doesn't feel post at all.
Not even slightly. They see it often as a Western academic invention, a way for scholars, mostly in Western universities, to carve out a new field, gain academic capital, maybe even feel progressive, while often ignoring or marginalizing the ongoing urgent struggles of indigenous peoples whose lands are still occupied, whose resources are still exploited, whose political sovereignty is still denied.
It risks becoming another way to talk about them. instead of listening to them.
Or worse, a way to manage dissent, to contain the critique within academic frameworks. The most powerful, concise rejection of this idea came from the Aboriginal activist Bobby Sykes.
Yes, the famous quote.
It's legendary. Apparently, at an academic conference where the term post-colonialism was being thrown around, she just cut through it all and asked, quite pointedly, what, post-colonialism? Have they left?
Cuts right to the chase.
Absolutely. It's a brutal, undeniable reminder that for many, the colonial structures of power, the occupation, the extraction, they haven't vanished just because a flag changed somewhere. The post is a luxury many cannot afford.
Okay, so if the traditional tools, Western concepts of history, research, even theory, are so deeply entangled with colonialism, then decolonizing can't just be about critique. It has to be about building something new, creating different tools.
Absolutely. The focus shifts from simply pointing out the problems to actively creating alternatives. And that requires more than just good ideas or good intentions. It requires praxis.
Praxis, meaning
Action that's deeply informed by theory, but also constantly reflecting on that action. It's this cycle. Think critically, act strategically, reflect on the impact, refine the theory, act again. It's not just armchair theorizing, and it's not just random activism.
It's theory and action feeding each other.
Exactly. And the goal isn't just to understand the world like in traditional research, or even just to document failure. The goal is to change the world, to actively participate in community liberation and transformation.
And this need for praxis, for different tools, is what has fueled the rise of indigenous methodologies all over the world. It's a conscious rejection of that old idea that research methods can somehow be neutral or culture-free.
Yeah, that assumption that you can just take a survey method designed in Chicago and apply it unmodified in rural Kenya or the Arctic. It's deeply problematic. Indigenous methodologies start from the opposite premise, that research must be culturally grounded, politically conscious, and ethically responsible to the specific community involved.
Can you give us a concrete example of what that looks like in practice?
A really well-developed and influential example is Kapapa Maori research from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's an approach developed by Maori scholars specifically for research involving Maori communities.
And what makes it fundamentally different from, say, a standard university research project?
Well, first and foremost, it explicitly privileges Maori worldviews, Maori values, tikanga Maori, language, and cultural protocols. The starting point is Maori reality, not Western theory.
Okay.
And its central goal is overtly political. Kapa Maori research isn't about knowledge for knowledge's sake. It must aim to make a positive, tangible difference for the Maori community being researched. It has to contribute to their well-being, their aspirations, their struggles.
So benefit to the community is built in from the start.
It's non-negotiable, which makes it inherently counter-hegemonic. It's designed to challenge and resist the dominant colonial knowledge system, not just fit into it. Ideally, it's research by Maori, with Maori, and for Maori. It prioritizes things like collective benefit, community control over the research process and data, and long-term accountability.
That sounds incredibly ethical. But how does it work practically? Especially if, say, the funding is coming from a mainstream university that expects certain outputs or adheres to standard ethics board procedures. How do you translate those high ideals into actual research steps?
That's where the cultural framework becomes crucial. Kaupa Maori embeds ethics within traditional Maori concepts and sayings known as wakatoki. These aren't just nice proverbs. They act as guiding principles, ethical benchmarks, and even governance mechanisms for the research.
So they're more holistic than just getting informed consent forms signed.
Much more. They cover the whole relationship. Smith outlines several key ones. For instance, aroha ki te tangata. This means having genuine care, respect, even love for the people involved. It's about the researcher's attitude, empathy, not detachment.
It's very different from objective distance.
Totally. Then there's kanoe kitea, literally, the scene face. It means you have to show up, be present, interact face-to-face, build relationships. You can't just send out surveys or hide behind emails. It ensures personal accountability.
Makes sense. What else?
Te tiro, wakarongo, korero, which means look, listen, and then speak. It emphasizes deep observation, patient listening, really understanding the context before you jump in with interpretations or solutions.
Humility built into the method.
Yes, and manaki ki te tangata, share, host, be generous. Research shouldn't just be extractive. The researcher has a responsibility to give back, to share resources, knowledge, food, time. It's about reciprocity.
Building a real relationship.
And finally, a crucial one. Kaua e takahia te mana o te tangata. Do not trample on the mana, the prestige, the spiritual power, the dignity of the people or the community. Protecting people's integrity is paramount, even if the research deals with difficult issues.
It really does flip the power dynamic. Western ethics often prioritize protecting the institution through anonymity and distance. This prioritizes protecting the community through relationship and accountability.
Absolutely. But this deep connection, this commitment, also creates a really complex situation for the researcher themselves. This is the indigenous researcher's dilemma.
What's the dilemma?
They occupy this unique, often difficult space. Within their own community, they are an insider. They share the culture, the language, the history, the lived experience. They have a deep understanding. But within the academic world, the university, the funding bodies, they're often treated as an outsider. Their methodologies might be questioned, their closeness to the community seen as bias, their political commitments viewed with suspicion. They might have been trained in Western institutions themselves, creating internal conflict, too.
That reminds me of Patricia Hill Collins's concept of the outsider within, caught between two worlds, fully belonging to neither in some ways.
Exactly that. The community expects them to be knowledgeable about research, to uphold cultural protocols, to be an advocate. The academy expects them to conform to its norms, its standards of rigor and objectivity. It's a constant negotiation.
Navigating intense pressures from both sides. Loyalty, validity, it's all on the line.
Which is why that anecdote Smith shares about her own experience visiting Maori mothers is so telling. It captures this tension perfectly.
Can you walk us through that story? It really humanizes this intellectual dilemma.
Sure. So the researcher Smith herself, in this case, was, in many ways, an insider. She was Maori, a mother herself, involved in the Maori language revival movement, and she knew some of the women she was planning to interview socially.
So there was a pre-existing relationship trust.
Yes. But when she went to their homes, specifically in her role as a university researcher, everything shifted. The hat she was wearing, the researcher hat, represented the institution, the outside system, even though the person wearing it was known.
Interesting. How did that manifest?
She noticed things were different. The homes were immaculate, absolutely spotless. The children were dressed in their best clothes. Elaborate food far beyond a casual cup of tea had been prepared.
Okay, so they were being very hospitable.
Extremely hospitable, according to formal Maori protocol, Manakatanga. But she had this dawning realization, this level of formality, this perfection. It wasn't just politeness. It was the kind of reception you give to a very important visitor, perhaps someone in authority, someone who might judge you.
So the formality itself created a kind of distance.
Exactly. She saw it as, in her words, barriers constructed to keep the outsider at bay. It was a subtle, culturally appropriate way for the women to manage the encounter, to maintain control, to protect their mana in the face of the research process, even though they knew and liked the researcher personally.
Wow. So even as an insider, the role itself made her an outsider in that moment.
Precisely. And she realized something crucial. Unlike an external researcher who could just collect their data, write the report, and leave, she had to live with the consequences of this research, these interactions within her community forever. That forces a completely different level of ethical reflection, humility, and responsibility than standard methods often demand.
It really underscores that identity, relationship, insider-outsider status, there aren't fixed labels. They're constantly being negotiated, especially when research and power dynamics are involved. It demands constant self-awareness.
A profound reflexivity, yeah. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about generating knowledge. So building on these new methodologies, this critique, there's a broader movement, a collective effort that Smith calls the Indigenous Peoples Project. It's about moving beyond theory to a concrete agenda for action.
And it's not just a random list of demands, right? It's structured around these core concepts, these tides, as she calls them.
That's right. She frames the agenda around 4 interconnected tides, which represent both ongoing conditions and goals: survival, recovery, development, and self-determination.
Okay, let's break those down briefly. What does each one encompass?
Survival is the most basic, but still urgent for many. It's about the literal survival of peoples, but also the survival of languages, cultural practices, arts, social structures, everything under threat.
Keeping the foundations intact.
Recovery is about actively reclaiming what was lost or damaged by colonization. This includes rights, lands, territories, but also suppressed histories, cultural knowledge, spiritual connections, psychological well-being after trauma.
Healing and restoration.
Development focuses on building sustainable futures from within the community. This often involves economic initiatives, health programs, educational systems, but defined and controlled by the community itself, based on their own values, not imposed from outside.
Community-led progress.
And finally, self-determination is the overarching political goal. It's about achieving genuine sovereignty, the right and ability for indigenous nations and peoples to control their own lives, lands, resources, and political futures free from external domination.
Got it. Survival, recovery, development, self-determination.
Yeah.
They all weave together.
They absolutely do. They're not necessarily sequential steps. A community might be working on all four simultaneously, depending on their specific circumstances and priorities.
So let's make this even more concrete. Smith outlines numerous specific projects happening globally under this umbrella. Can we dive into a few key examples, starting with this idea of survivance and remembering?
Yes, survivance is a powerful concept, really pushed by the Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Weisenor. It's deliberately combining survival and resistance.
So it's not just passively enduring, it's actively resisting disappearance.
Exactly. It's an assertion of active presence, of indigenous vitality, creativity, and inherent worth. It pushes back against those colonial narratives that portray indigenous peoples as tragic victims destined to vanish or simply assimilated remnants. Survivance is about celebrating continuity and adaptation.
And how does remembering fit into that active resistance?
Remembering in this context isn't just about looking back fondly. It's a crucial political and healing act. Colonization often involved deliberate attempts to erase memory, destroying records, banning languages, severing connections to land and ancestors.
So remembering is defiance.
It's defiance, yes, and it's therapy. It's about consciously reconnecting bodies, experiences, and places. It often involves confronting painful histories, historical trauma, but doing so collectively as a way to understand the present and heal. Reframing shared suffering not as individual pathology, but as a logical outcome of systemic historical injustice.
Which connects directly to the next project, reframing social problems. Colonial systems often blamed the victim, right? Pointing to high rates of addiction, suicide, mental illness in indigenous communities as evidence of some inherent cultural flaw or individual failure.
Precisely. It pathologizes the oppressed. The Decolonial Reframing Project turns this completely around. It argues forcefully that these aren't primarily individual failings. They are the predictable, understandable consequences of generations of colonization, dispossession, cultural disruption, systemic racism, historical trauma, and the ongoing lack of self-determination.
So the problem isn't the person, it's the structure.
The root cause is structural, historical, political. And if that's the cause, then the solution can't just be individual therapy or assimilation programs. The solution has to address the historical context, community healing, economic justice, cultural revitalization, and political sovereignty. It changes the entire frame from fixing broken people to fixing broken systems and empowering communities.
That structural lens is also critical for understanding gendering colonial legacies. How did colonialism mess with gender roles and power dynamics within indigenous societies?
Often profoundly. While there was huge diversity, many indigenous societies had gender relations that were far more balanced or complementary than the patriarchal systems Europeans brought with them. Women often held significant political, economic, spiritual, and social power.
And colonization disrupted that.
Yes, frequently. Colonial administrations, missionaries, legal systems often imposed European patriarchal norms. They only recognized male leaders, assigned property rights primarily to men, confined women to domestic roles, and actively undermined female authority and traditional knowledge systems. It wasn't just accidental. It was often a deliberate strategy to break down indigenous social structures.
The example from New Zealand about the term for sovereignty is really striking here.
It really is. The Maori concept of rangatiratanga, meaning chieftainship, leadership, authority, sovereignty, was often misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted by the British colonizers. They tended to translate it and recognize it as something only men could hold.
Ignoring female chiefs.
Exactly. They ignored or downplayed the fact that Maori women historically could and did hold rangatiratanga. They were leaders, landowners, political figures in their own right. This colonial distortion had lasting effects, marginalizing women's roles.
So Maori women had to fight to reclaim that history.
Yes. Smith talks about a major claim brought before the Waitangi Tribunal, the body that hears claims related to breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. Prominent Maori women had to meticulously argue, using genealogies, historical accounts, oral traditions, that they were also Rangatira, that their leadership was inherent in Maori society before the British arrived and imposed their own biased view. It's a fight to decolonize the understanding of their own history and internal power structures.
Let's shift to something with huge contemporary impact: rejecting the carceral society. The statistics on Indigenous incarceration rates in countries like Canada, the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, they're shocking.
They are appalling. Indigenous peoples are massively overrepresented in prisons, in youth detention, in deaths in custody. From a decolonial perspective, this isn't just about crime and punishment in the usual sense.
How is it framed differently?
It's often seen as a direct continuation of colonial warfare and control, just using different tools. The prison system, like the reservation system before it, is viewed as one of the master's tools, a mechanism designed to manage, contain, and remove the native problem from settler society under the guise of public safety or justice.
So the system itself is part of the problem.
The argument is that the whole prison industrial complex disproportionately targets and harms Indigenous communities, perpetuating cycles of trauma, poverty, and family breakdown. It benefits from this cycle rather than solving underlying issues.
So rejecting the carceral society means abolition.
It pushes towards that, certainly. It involves a radical reimagining. The Decolonial project asks, what if prisons simply weren't the default answer? What did Indigenous societies do before prisons to deal with harm, conflict, wrongdoing?
They must have had other ways.
Many had highly sophisticated systems of accountability, conflict resolution, restorative justice, mediation, often focused on repairing harm, healing relationships, reintegrating the person into the community fabric, rather than permanent exclusion and punishment. So rejecting the carceral model means looking back to those principles and imagining contemporary systems based on community healing, addressing root causes, and restorative practices, not just punitive ones.
A fundamental shift in thinking about justice. Finally, let's talk about listening to the land, or living in relation. This seems to challenge some core Western philosophical ideas about humans being separate from nature.
It absolutely does. It challenges the anthropocentrism, the human-centeredness that underpins so much Western thought, including humanism. In many Indigenous worldviews, humans aren't the pinnacle of creation or the only beings with agency and importance.
So nature isn't just a backdrop or a resource.
Not at all. Non-human entities, mountains, rivers, forests, animals, rocks, the land itself, are often seen as relatives, as persons, as beings with their own agency, spirit, rights, and responsibilities. The relationship isn't one of domination or stewardship over nature, but of kinship and reciprocity with all of existence. Relationality is the key principle.
Living as part of the world, not on top of it.
Exactly. It demands a different kind of ethics, a profound respect for the interconnectedness of all things.
And incredibly, this philosophical difference has actually led to major legal changes in some places, translating Indigenous cosmology into state law.
Yes, and it's groundbreaking. The most famous example, which Smith discusses, is the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
It's a river that became a legal person.
That's the one. Through a Treaty of Waitangi settlement finalized in 2017, the Wanganui River was granted legal personhood. It now has the same legal rights, powers, duties, and liabilities as a human person.
How does that even work? Who speaks for the river in court?
The settlement established a new framework. The river is represented by two guardians called Tipau Tupua. One is appointed by the Crown, the government, and one is appointed by the Wanganui Iwi, the Maori people of the river. They are legally mandated to act in the best interests of the river itself, representing its health and well-being.
And this was based directly on the Maori relationship with the river.
Entirely. It stems from the ancestral Wanganui Iwi saying, Ko te o ko pe hoko. I am the river and the river is me. The law finally recognized this inseparable connection, this kinship, this personhood that the Iwi had always known.
That's a profound example of cognitive justice, isn't it? Of an Indigenous way of knowing, fundamentally changing the state's legal framework.
It's monumental. It shifts the river from being mere property, a resource to be managed or exploited, to being a living ancestor, a legal entity with inherent rights that must be respected. It's decolonization in legal action.
Wow. We've covered so much ground. From the critique of research as a dirty word, through the flawed conceptual pillars of colonialism, to these incredibly powerful and creative Indigenous methodologies and projects for action. It's clear this isn't just academic nitpicking.
Not at all. It's a deeply political, intellectual, and frankly moral undertaking. Decolonizing Methodologies, the whole Indigenous Peoples Project. It's
Yeah.
about fundamentally changing how knowledge is produced, who owns it, who benefits from it, and whose worldview shapes our understanding of reality.
It really hammers home that point about fighting to get the story right, but also fighting for the right to tell the story using your own frameworks, your own values.
Exactly. It's about cognitive justice, the right for different knowledge systems to exist, to be respected, and to inform action, especially for the communities they originate from. It's an assertion against centuries of intellectual suppression.
I'm struck by the context Smith mentions when finishing the latest edition of her book right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. That global crisis seemed to lay bare so many inequalities.
It really did, and her reflection on that moment is quite stark, quite sobering.
What was her takeaway?
Essentially, that the pandemic brutally confirms something many Indigenous communities already knew. When push comes to shove, the powerful systems, the global structures, they still fundamentally don't prioritize the well-being or concerns of Indigenous peoples. The world of the powerful still doesn't care about us, is how she put it, I believe.
That's a harsh assessment, but probably felt very real during that time.
It reinforces the absolute necessity for Indigenous communities not to wait for permission, not to wait for external saviors, or for the dominant systems to suddenly become benevolent. They have to rely on their own knowledge, their own values, their own resilience.
They have to be proactive, advocate fiercely, build their own solutions.
Precisely. They need to be creative, strategic, and fundamentally look after themselves, asserting their sovereignty in practical ways every single day. Change isn't going to be handed down. It has to be built from the ground up, from within.
So the future isn't about waiting, it's about acting.
Absolutely, and that's why, despite the often grim realities and the scale of the challenge, Smith ultimately frames decolonization as a practice of hopefulness.
Hopefulness, after everything we've discussed about the trauma and ongoing struggles.
Yes, but it's not a naive or passive hope. It's a hard-won strategic hopefulness. It's a belief, grounded in action, that a different, more just, more sustainable future is possible. But it's a future that has to be actively created through intellectual rigor, political struggle, cultural revitalization, and unwavering self-determination.
A future achieved by doing, not wishing.
Exactly. It's about believing in the possibility of change and then doing the incredibly hard work to make it happen. That's the path towards genuine global cognitive justice, where multiple ways of knowing can coexist and contribute to a richer, more equitable world for everyone.
A powerful, challenging, but ultimately hopeful place to end. This has been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for walking us through this complex and vital material.
My pleasure. It's crucial thinking for anyone interested in where knowledge comes from, where it's going, and what genuine global justice might look like.